Hello.
I'm going to tell you a little bit about our next couple of programs, and then I'll introduce our speakers today. We have two programs coming up next week. On May 2nd is our annual open house. Louder? Okay. Next weekend is our annual open house. It's a little early this year. We're trying to coordinate it with things going on in the town and with the Renunciation Act signing in 1776. So from 2 to 5, the house will be open for tours. We have special exhibits in there honoring the Declaration of Independence anniversary. We also have toys and games on the lawn from 2 to 5. We have someone reading the Renunciation Act at 2:15, and we'll have colonial refreshments that we're making ourselves. And they're a little tricky. The recipes aren't that easy. I'm on my third try with the Martha Washington bonbons, so we may not be that good. They're really very difficult recipes. They're not very specific. And then on May 3rd, we have a program at 2 o'clock on the conspiracy to burn the British schooner Gatsby. And that's Dr. Concannon will be doing that. Today's program will be presented by Pete Ogle on recognizing the enslaved of Westerlies. Pete is a member of the Anti-Racist Coalition in Westerly, as well as the Multicultural Committee in the town of Westerly. So no further ado.
Well, thank you all for coming. This is a pleasure, and I want to start off by really thanking people that have helped me with this, because I'm not a historian, I'm an engineer, and got involved in this about 8 years ago, and it's been kind of an on and off project, but certainly Nina Wright at the library was a help all along. And then a woman by the name of Kayla Balo at the Newport Historic Society kind of reactivated me into this about 1.5 years ago. And then Mark Murphy kind of helped me tie up some loose ends over the last 6 months or so of this. Mark's a local guy as well. So, that kind of says it. Helen asked me to do this because she had been kind of a consultant for me over the years. And she asked me, and I didn't want to say no, and it provided a good way for me to tie up this project and get and publish it. And you're the audience. So I hope to provide a little background on the slavery in Westerly, provide insight into the lives of 3 individuals and their families that I uncovered. There are a lot more that could be uncovered, and provide recognition of their service to Westerly. My research really started when I saw back in 2018 the movie Traces of the Trade by the DeWolf family, and discovered that slavery wasn't just something that happened south of the Mason-Dixon line. And then the controversy over our beloved Columbus statue provided more incentive to understand slavery in its big picture, and in particular here in Westerly. So what was happening with slavery in the colonial period, like 1600s to 1800s, and what significance did it play here? Because the picture's too big to deal with the whole world of slavery. So I just focused, and I will today, just on what I've uncovered here. So, as I see it, the Pequod War of 1635 and the King Philip's War of 1675, they were nasty, bloody wars here in southern New England, And I think they kind of provided the launch point, the kickoff, the stimulus for enslavement, because hundreds of Indian men, women, and children were enslaved as a result of that, particularly King Philip's War. A lot were sold south, and others were kept here and enslaved. And that certainly started off slavery in Westerly. I never found any records of who lived here then, who got slaves as part of kind of a recompense for having participated in the war. But certainly some of the local families were very active in particularly King Philip's War. And then enslavement of Africans kind of followed from that, because there weren't that many Native Americans to utilize, and then it became a big commercial venture. Not so much here in Westerly, but certainly in Rhode Island itself. Then the laws governing the rights of blacks and Indians you could make a whole story on that, and I never attempted to understand it all, but it was complex, it changed, but always trying to control their lives. And in those days, let's face it, very few people had real rights. If you weren't a landowner or well off, you probably didn't get the right to vote, even if you were white. And certainly women had no rights to vote. But then after the Revolutionary War, slavery pretty much phased out of here in Westerly and in New England. But the easiest way that I found to enter this was in the, and don't try to read anything other than words that I've written, and I'll talk you through it. The easiest way to launch into this was the census of 1774, which is very complete, and you can find it in various documents, handwritten versions that have been copied, and then printed versions. But the limitation of them is that they only tell you the heads of the household. They don't tell you who the wife was or the names of any of those, of the enslaved people. But basically it broke it down into these categories: white men and women, Indian, male and female, black, male and female, and above and below the age of 16. So there were, at that time, in 1774, there were 274 families in Westerly, about 1,800 people total, and there were about 90 or so black and Native Americans. And if you read anything from those times, then whether they were black or Native Americans, there was a lot of intermarriage between the races, and the identification gets confused. But the population was about 90%, 95% white. When you go through the census in detail, you find that about 20 families held about 90 enslaved people. And they're the families, they're listed on the left. They're all, for the most part, very familiar names to us if you've been around Westerly for any length of time. Most of the individuals were kept, most families had maybe one or two at most. There were a couple of larger farms in Westerly. If you go over to Charlestown and South Kingstown, you found that it has much larger plantations where they enslaved many more people, but again, I was just focused on understanding Westerly. And in going through records in town, and these are town records, probates, wills, manumissions, Civil War, Revolutionary War records, census records, the DAR's Forgotten Patriots listing. These are the names of blacks and Native Americans that I could find, that I haven't found to this date. So there are about, I don't know, 25 or so names here of people. Some of them we just know their first name. Others have taken the name of their owner, and others this Quaco, it must be, I think it's a Native American name. So I ended up focusing on three families, three individuals and their families to do the work that I've done, and that's where I will spend the rest of my time here today. The three people are, first one is Sharper Boers. He also went by Cato. I ran across his name when I was doing research on the history of the land where Wilcox Park is today, and his owner showed up there. Then there's Cujo Ward. He was a personal servant of Governor Samuel Ward, and many of you would know that Samuel Ward lived here for many years in Westerly. And then Thomas Ray, I came across his name in reading Westerly and His Witnesses by Dennison, and that's a history of Westerly that was written in the 1860s or so. And Dennison identifies Thomas Ray as a colored family of excellent repute living in Westerly, and they lived in Thomas lived here in the 17 and 1800s. Unfortunately, there are no pictures of these people or their families. So I will now go through, let you know the details of that I found. So Cujo, like I said, was the personal servant of Samuel Ward. He was about 33 years old when he was purchased by Samuel Ward from his sister, Samuel Ward's sister, Isabella Marchant, in Newport. And I guess Ward had come from Newport. Cujo accompanied Samuel Ward to Philadelphia as his personal servant. Ward was very active in the Continental Congress. He had Cujo vaccinated for smallpox, but Ward apparently didn't have the time to do that, and he died of smallpox in March of 1776. If he had lived another 4 months, his name would have been on the Declaration of Independence, and Westerly would have a bigger star on its map by then. But Cujo got permission to return home back to Westerly and brought Ward's papers back. Ward was buried in Philadelphia. If we dig into who was Ward, Ward had 5 slaves. Cujo and Peggy were 2 of his slaves, but there were 3 others that showed up in his documents when they were closing out his estate. He lived at the corner of Langworthy Road and Shore Road. And certainly pictures of his house in later years. When Ward's passed away, he was deeply in debt, and they sold off his estate. And Cujo and Peggy, his 2 slaves, were manumitted in 1777 as part of the closing out of the estate by Ethan Clark. And it stated in the manumission documents on the right that as Ward had intended. I kind of think that meant that Ward probably hadn't written it down anywhere, but expressed his intention that they should be manumitted. I don't know what happened to the other 3 slaves that he had. But shortly thereafter, Peggy buys a 2-acre lot in Westerly from Edward Bliven for $20. they were free. It says so in the document, that sales agreement. And trying to locate where the property is, I never know precisely, but I did find records that it was adjacent to Thomas Ray's property. We'll talk about Thomas Ray in a little bit. Cujo and Peggy don't appear to have ever had any children. They're listed in the 1790 census. They show up in 1806 in town council records with the statement, hath for some time past and still remain in want and need of speedy support from Governor Ward's heirs. They were old at this point, and obviously of ill health. Peggy dies later that year. The property gets sold off to Oliver Wilcox as payment, $35 worth, to support Cujo in his later years. I'm not sure where he lived at that point, but he does show up in the 1820 census, so he lived a good bit longer with a household of 2. I don't know where they were buried. That's a sales agreement of her 2-acre lot. So, if I go then to Thomas Ray and Sarah Bennett, who we married, and there we are able to find 4 generations of this family. And as I said, they're identified by Dennison as a colored family of excellent repute. And he goes on to say, living in Guinea Hollow. So where is Guinea Hollow? Well, the name Guinea comes from Africa, that portion of Africa where a number of slaves came from, and there's no clear identification of who and whether that's attached to Thomas Ray's name or just the fact that black people lived in that area of town. But in any case, Thomas Ray's cemetery is where it's noted on the map. So that's just off of Shore Road, off of Rock Ridge Road. It's a historic cemetery. It's identified with the typical white sign. It's overgrown. It's very small. There are, I guess, a half dozen people buried there, but only 3 that we know of: Thomas Ray, Sarah, and their one of their sons. But as I dug into it, well, who was this Thomas Ray? And he shows up in other documents. I found him in a book that was written on black history of Block Island, and in various records, census records, he's listed as black or as an Indian. Was he in some fashion related to Simon Ray? Simon Ray was a major landowner in Block Island and in Westerly. He owned hundreds of acres apparently in Westerly. And Governor Samuel Ward married one of Ray's children, one of Simon Ray's children, Anna Ray. So there's this coincidence that Thomas Ray from Block Island ends up living next to the Wards who were related to the Rays. But I've never been able to piece together the true history there of his background. Thomas Ray is first noted in Westerly in 1774. He shows up, I think he shows up as Tom Ray in Governor Ward's papers, probate documents, as being owed 19 shillings, just under £1. Whether he ever got paid for that, who knows? And the closing out of Ward's estate. But then this woman from Newport Historic Society put me into understanding pension records of the Revolutionary War. And it turned out Thomas Ray served, and there were pension records. And all of a sudden, a whole new pile of information about his life unfolded. So he was born in 1752 on Block Island, and he died in Westerly in 1839. The pension records provide a whole lot of interesting information because these people had to justify their receiving the pension, and these pensions weren't being given out until the 1830s. This is 50 years after these guys served. So there's a lot of people had to provide affidavits from people who knew them, and in some cases personal records, to attest that they served. And out of those records unfolds Thomas Ray's history. That he married a woman named Sarah Bennett in 1776, December of 1776, right at the end of the year. She was a black woman who had moved from the family of Job Bennett from Newport. It seems that Job Bennett and his wife, they had 3 or 4 enslaved people, but they came from Newport at the time that the British occupied Newport, and presumably they were patriots, because Westerly was a hotbed of patriots. So they came to Westerly to get away from the British, and they came with this woman Sarah, and shortly thereafter, she married Thomas Ray. And the write-up on them says, from some woman who attended this wedding, said it was quite a splendid appearance. The couple were dressed in quite a splendid appearance in a style not used in the county. So they must have been dressed like they came from Newport, not like a bunch of farmers here in London. But then shortly thereafter, in March of 1777, he joins the Rhode Island militia, artillery, and he's stationed all around Narragansett Bay, because the British occupied Aquidneck Island, and he then served for a year. That's how long he signed up for, and by that time his wife had given birth to their first child, and he obviously had to take care of things at home. So the Rays had 3 sons. Joseph Aspinwall Ray, and the reason I've highlighted him is because I'm going to go through three more generations of history, and we can get lost. Joseph has a history that we'll follow for a while. Gideon stayed with Thomas and Sarah and lived in Westerly and died here in 1839. And son Thomas was a seaman, and they lost track of no history beyond 1837. So we don't know what really happened to him at all. They were all signed up in the Seamen's Protection in New London, and that provided documentation that they were free American citizens. And if you were a black person at that time, that would have been an important document to have. In the census of 1790, the Ray family has 5 people, and just by the way the census was, people are listed in it, There were 3 other families listed right after the Rays: Prince Bennett, Cujo Ward, and Mary Hayden, and I know they, from other records, were all black families. So they apparently all lived in this Guinea Hollow area of Westerly. Thomas purchased 12-acre land in 1802 from Joshua Kenyon. The succeeding census shows that he has a family of 5 throughout that period of time. I think some of those turned out to be grandchildren. And then Thomas Ray purchased at least 3 other parcels of land, so he was doing very well. In 1737, he sold the property to Gideon. He was getting old, and he died 2 years later. And even Gideon purchased more land. So they appeared, there's no way of understanding exactly how many parcels or how much they had, but at least close to 40 acres, scattered in 2 or 3 locations here in Western. So Thomas petitions for his pension in 1831. He dies in 1839. Sarah receives his pension after he dies. Gideon drowns in Wharton Pond in 1840. Sarah inherits everything, and there are records that show the grandchildren visiting her and even caring for her. The records also show that they were active members of the Seventh-day Baptist Church, and the congregation built its church at the corner of Langworthy near the corner of Langworthy and the Post Road, on land that earlier Thomas Ray had owned. So whether he gave them that land, I wouldn't know. And that's part of the written document on the right is part of this pension record, and you can see Thomas Ray's name signed at the bottom. So obviously he could write. I don't think he wrote the majority of the document, but his handwriting looks like an old guy's handwriting. The Ray's grandchildren visited her after Thomas had died, and Sarah Bennett Ray Melvin, who was a granddaughter, and her husband cared for Sarah in 1850. They show up on the census, and Sarah dies at 1852 at the age of 97. The Guinea Hollow land that he had was sold to Albert Langworthy, who was buying up all sorts of property in those days, in 1896. And then another Ray granddaughter, I guess, sells the rest of the 19 acres in Dunn's Corner to a guy by the name of Barnes in 1980. So they own land here in Western Leeds for over 100 years. We don't know whether those lands were being farmed for the last 50 years or not. I would look for those records. So back on, I had mentioned Joseph Ray, Joseph Aspinwall Ray. He was Thomas's son. He became a seaman. He settled in Falmouth, Massachusetts. He became a postman up in Falmouth and delivered the mail to Martha's Vineyard by boat, obviously, for 28 years. He married Annis Harrington, and they were a prominent member of the community. They had a bunch of kids, and several of them show up later in this presentation and are noted in history. I already mentioned Sarah Bennett, Melvin, and Anna Harrington Bright, who cared for and visited Sarah at various times. Joseph Ray dies in 1837. Annis goes to New Bedford, Massachusetts, to live with her daughter. And Annis is noted as having been a very avid reader. In other words, it says that she cleaned out, or she read all the books in the minister's library in New Bedford in her later years. So they had 3 children, or a bunch of children, but Charles Bennett is the one we'll chase after at this point, and he becomes quite noted. He was Thomas Ray's grandchild. He had an early education in Falmouth, Massachusetts, and he worked for 5 years at the Ray farm. Whether that was summers or full-time, I don't know. But then he went to Wesleyan Academy to study the ministry. He went to Wesleyan University, or tried to, but the university had a lot of large southern student body, and he lasted there about a month before they drove him out. But he was educated and studied the ministry, and he went to New York City, and he was head minister of the Bethesda Congregational Church in New York City. He also wrote, and became the publisher of the Colored American. That's a print of a copy of it over there. It was a weekly magazine that he published, or helped publish, for 3 years in New York City. And he was very active in the Underground Railroad. I have a book in the back that his daughters wrote after he died that does a very good job of summarizing his life, except his early life, of his writings, of where he went. But he was highly traveled. He was very active in the Underground Railroad operating out of New York City. It's hard to say how many people would have gone through his house, but it's clear that a lot of people did on their way to freedom. While he's in New York City, he marries a woman, Charlotte Burroughs. They have 7 children. Really only the 3 daughters show up. Charlotte goes to Howard University. She's the first woman admitted to the bar in New York City, in Washington, D.C., excuse me. And she's the first African-American attorney in the United States. And in the end, she marries a man by the name of Daniel Frame. The other 2 daughters both become teachers. One gets her master's degree, a linguist, a poet, and living in New York City. And you could say in Charles's writings, in one of his speeches, I think apparently in more than one of his speeches, he refers to himself as a very light-skinned man. And is quoted as saying, "I'd have to go back 3 or 4 generations to find an ancestor who wasn't mixed blood." And I think that goes back to his origins in Block Island, and was he part Indian, part black. There's one history that says that there was a shipwreck of Germans immigrating to this country, and 2 women survived that shipwreck, and of course they spoke German, and they were on Block Island in 1730 something, and they settled there and married, and so there's stories that he's related to one of those women. We'll never know. And the last part Ray Benham, who's one of Nair, who's Charles's sister and granddaughter of Thomas Ray. She marries a man, Alexander, in Nantucket. They're both very active abolitionists, and they petition and get the state of Massachusetts to integrate the schools in Nantucket. And they adopt a woman, a young 10-year-old, I guess, who seems to have been someone that Charles Ray had arranged the Underground Railroad to deliver by boat to Nantucket, and his sister, Elizabeth, adopt this child. And she has an interesting history. She gets educated like everybody else in her family. She graduates from high school, becomes a teacher. She joins up with the Union Army as part of a program, the Freedmen's Bureau, to educate black children in New Orleans towards the end of the Civil War in 1864 to 1868. That's quite a feat, I think. There were race riots shortly thereafter. She leaves, goes to San Antonio, then comes back to New Orleans and becomes principal of the McDonough School in New Orleans. She marries, moves to New York City, runs a catering business with her husband, and files a patent on a pastry fork, and I wouldn't know how to use a pastry fork, and she exhibits it at the Columbia Exposition in Chicago in 1893, which I thought was an interesting piece of history. And then she's back in New York City living, and works with her aunts, Aunt Florence Ray and Henrietta Ray, on various projects, women's union house for protective women, protective union house for working girls in New York City. In the end, she moves to Brookfield, Connecticut with her son and dies in 1931. So that's a sketch of that. The third family was Sharper, and who was known also as Cato, and Esther Irons Bors. Sharper was owned by John Bors of Newport. He was a prominent merchant in Newport, involved in the slave trade. His whole family they were merchants, and they did all sorts of things, but they invested in enslaving ships like a lot of other people. He was very active in the Episcopal Church in Newport, and he was a founding member of the Redwood Library. Bors had 2 slaves that show up in the 1774 census. He married Dr. Babcock's daughter Hannah in 1762, and he had signed an oath of fidelity to the colonies in 1775, attesting that he was a patriot, supporter of the cause. Those are pictures of the John and Hannah Babcock Bors. So the British occupied Newport, and he wouldn't have found that too comfortable, I think. So John Bors purchases about between 16 and 18 acre parcel. It's listed both. And with a dwelling house, and it's located on the post road near Pawcatuck Bridge. And if you do some exploring the history, as I did, of that piece of property, it pretty much fits that red outlined area, which includes Wilcox Park, and then the land where the Y is today, and some private homes. That's about 18 acres within that red polygon. And that's how I got involved in, I was trying to understand the land of the history of the parkland before the Wilcox spot. But then in doing that, going through the papers down in Town Hall, I uncovered this manumission document, which is on the right there. And it is about, the guy has the most beautiful script in all of the documents I've gone through in Town Hall. And it's signed by both John Boris and Hannah. And it's a manumission document, you know, in February of 1778. And it would free Sharper when he reached the age of 30. But he was about 19 at that age. He had 11 more years to serve. And the document goes on to say that he will be manumitted, free, if he will behave himself honestly and faithfully in his said master's and mistress's service, and shall readily and cheerfully obey and reasonable commands to do, tend, perform, following, and any other his master and mistress, their heirs and assignees may require him, and he does not under any pretense skip town. So, I don't know how he took that. He had 11 more years to serve. But happening at this same time in the Revolutionary War, Rhode Island had decided to create what becomes known as the Black Regiment, Rhode Island's first regiment. It wasn't the first regiment, but it was identified as the first regiment. And that's where I learned more about his history, because Sharper goes and he enlists, and that meant that Rhode Island was accepting slaves who would enlist for the duration of the war, and their owners would be paid for them, but if they served, they would be free men when the war was over. And Sharper signed up, and John Boris got 120 pounds for it. And there were about 80 some slaves who signed up. There were also Indians, and some of them were probably enslaved, and probably some of them were freedmen. And in the spring of 1778, the regiment was combined with blacks that had been serving in Rhode Island's 1st and 2nd Regiment. At that point, they were down in the Valley Forge area. So those troops came up and joined these new recruits, providing some experienced people. And he served, Sharper served through the end of the war in 1783. He was involved in the Battle of Rhode Island, which happened on Aquidneck Island. And in summer of 1778, so I mean he'd been in service for 4 months, and he's in a pitched battle, and it was a pitched battle that they were involved in there, and they performed successfully. There was the Pine Bridge attack where Colonel Christopher Green, who was head of the regiment, was killed, and a number of other people were killed by Tories. And then they went on down to Yorktown, and they fought in Yorktown. And then they went up, after that, they went to Philadelphia, and then up to New York, and then up to the Schenectady area, and eventually took part in an attempt to attack the British fort at Oswego in the dead of winter of 1783. But the attack never happened. They were discovered, so they came on back to Saratoga and were disbanded. That is a lot of walking in the dead of winter. So after the war, and this is what his pension records really tell us, he settled in South Kingstown. He married Esther Irons. They were married by Reverend William Smith, and he shows up historically as the minister of the Narragansett Episcopal Church, which is in Wickford. And the building still exists. The picture up the top is what it used to look like with a steeple, but the building is still in existence and in good shape. They had 4 children. Margaret ended up in Providence working for Nicholas Brown. Lucy and Anthony stayed in South Kingston, and apparently his son John also worked for Nicholas Brown and dies at sea. Trumper makes it to 1839, his wife 1846. They receive a pension in Rhode Island pension in 1831, and then a federal pension in 1839. It doesn't appear that he could ever write. His pension documents were all done by other people. And that kind of summarizes what I have uncovered. I think it's kind of the tip of the iceberg. I think there are certainly a lot more enslaved people in Westerly that could be explored, and some of them are Black and some of them are Native American. And I've just touched on 3 of them. I think each played an active role in the founding of both our town and our country. About 10% of the 200 or so patriots, and by them I would describe men who actually served in various capacities during the Revolutionary War. About 10% of them were Indians and Blacks, and enlisted generally for long periods of time. I really think it's time that Westerly recognize the lives and services of these people, the Blacks and Indians and the Patriots, in a more formal fashion. We don't have any monuments to this town, whether they were veterans or not. There are organizations which certainly do that sort of thing, the DAR and SAR from the Patriot point of view. There's the Rhode Island Slave History Medallion Project, which I became aware of a half dozen years ago. They put monuments, small monuments, plaques, where we know that enslaved people lived. And the Witness Stone Project comes out of Connecticut, and it does a similar sort of thing. And it's a project that is more directed at involving middle school kids. 7th and 8th graders take part in that, in exploring those histories, going into town records and digging into them to find out these people's history. And that project, Stonington ran, and I think is running a repeat program of it right now, as did a church in South Kingston, ran a project with the Witness Stone project. Do I have any questions? Sure.
The Newport was a fairly significant center for trading slaves. They had slave auctions and so
Yes.
forth there. In all of your research on the various families or residents of Westerly, were there any records that people from Westerly purchased slaves at Newport?
They probably, I didn't actually, I mean, Sharper boars came from Newport.
Right.
And so did I would imagine Cujo did as well, because,
But they've been brought over from West Africa?
where they came from prior to that,
Right.
Those records are sketchy.
Sure.
But, and I'm not enough of a historian to know where to dig for all this. But I think there are a lot of people gathering that sort of data at this point. So if you're interested,
Okay.
I would get hold of the Newport Historic Society. They have good records on it. Sure.
Just curious, like with King Philip's War, how far into Rhode Island did it go down? I'd always just thought it was Massachusetts.
It is the whole state.
Oh, it is.
And
Because
even
the
into
Great
New York
the Great
and
Swamp fight
Massachusetts.
over in Kingston, where they wiped out the Narragansetts, was in the King Philip's War.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
But you have to remember that after the King Philip's War, the settlers who were in Westerly, who had come from Newport, went back to Newport because it wasn't safe here.
Yeah.
The Indians were, after the war, were burning down every settler's house. And so if there were 20 in Westerly, and there were some, they all went back. Elder John Crandall and those kind of people went back to Newport for a good time until things settled down.
Except for Tubman, his
And Philbrick's book, The Mayflower, gives the full extent of King Philip's War and all the movements of troops through South Kingstown, and it's pretty widespread. I mean, even we used to live in Walpole, Massachusetts, and there were battles up there, and Medfield, just north of us, burned to the ground during the war.
Most
So
of the
it's-
towns in Massachusetts were
Yeah.
burned
Yeah.
to some extent or another.
Yeah, 'cause I know when I worked with the Park Service up in Boston, we always talked about it more from the Boston Harbor Islands and so.
Yep.
Yeah.
I
That's
didn't
where they-
realize.
The Native Indians, the native slaves going to the Harbor Island.
Yeah.
I did research about early Westerly about 10 years ago, and one of the things that I read was that the number of people who died in proportion to the population of the area was the worst in any war in America.
Yeah, that's frequently quoted.
Yeah.
Yes, Mac?
The museum is working with the Newport Preservation Society, and we have found that the Bonner Granite Company made the monument in Patriots Park in Portsmouth, Rhode Island,
Yep.
which is honoring the blacks who served in the Rhode Island Army. Their exhibit opens at the end of June, called Reimagining the Revolution.
We went to a dedication of a big plaque, a granite plaque, I don't know, probably 3 or 4 years ago. And I was sitting there reading the names of all these individuals on it, and there was Cato Boers' name. You know, and I'm, holy mac. Yes.
I just want to offer this because I stumbled on a book that educated me to Rhode Island's history of slavery. It's called Dark Work.
Yep.
Have you read it or know of it? It's really worth reading because it gives you a deep dive into all that the state was involved in, starting in Newport and then finishing in Bristol. So if you haven't read it, Dark Work, it's a wonderful historical account.
Mary?
I wondered if anybody in this room has ideas for resurrecting the efforts to have a slave medallion in Westerly. I'd love to hear if anybody would like to work on that.
What would it entail?
The program that is run out of Newport, Slave History Medallion Project, it's a fairly straightforward process. A guy, I think, Charles Roberts, who runs the program, he's a black man in Newport. And it's, the nice part about it is you end up with a little plaque on a little granite pedestal. And it just gives the name and a very few facts, but there's a QR code on it. And on the QR code, the town, whoever's sponsoring this, can put any history it wants. So it would be the history of that gentleman, or that how he fitted into the town, or his family. It's set up to be locally focused. But if you're interested, I know how to get in touch with those people. And then the one, the Witness Stone project, like I said, it's been run, it's ongoing in Stonington. They had their middle school kids do a very beautiful presentation about a year and a half ago, I guess. It's a program tailored towards teaching kids about the history and having them do some of the legwork on it.
Was that in regards to Fortune?
I beg your pardon?
Was that in regards to Fortune?
No, there was some other people.
Okay.
Pete,
Yes.
I remember that we talked with Charles Roberts, and
Yeah.
Pete's right that it's not a difficult process. It's finding a place to put it. And all these other towns have easily found places to put it, so it would be great if we would see that as an easy task.
Any other questions? Thank you very much.